Hello everybody and welcome back to another video lesson for 6th grade history. As you guys know, we've been discussing the American Revolution, which is the war that eventually gave the United States its independence from Great Britain, because as we've talked about, they were colonies under Great Britain's control, and due to the unfair treatment they were getting, they wanted to be free, and they set off on this journey to try and become independent. They were going to face off against one of the biggest navies and armies in the world at the time, and they were hoping to win. Nobody knew at the time if they had it in them, but we are going to see soon enough exactly what they did in order to win this war. Now, so far, we've talked about the reasons why they began the American Revolution. We also talked about the people who were major players in the war as well, those important revolutionary people that you should know the names of by now because we've been talking about them for a couple of days. But what makes a war is really the events that happen. So that's what we're going to get into now. We're going to talk about the important events in the Revolutionary War. Now, if you take a look at your note sheet, you'll notice that it is called the Revolutionary War Events Mega Packet. Now, this is going to have all of our events and our discussion on the Declaration of Independence contained inside of it, but there's going to be three different videos that is going to explain what you're going to put down in your note sheet. So you're not going to complete this entire thing today. Instead, you are going to do this over a period of a few days, actually throughout the rest of this weekend and next. We're going to be looking at those events and talking about those events. Now, if you take a look at the top of your note sheet, you're going to see a couple of definitions, which you don't have to fill anything in for. They've already been filled in for you. But we need to know these terms because it's something that you're going to hear now that the war has actually started and these events are taking place. And that is the difference between a loyalist and a patriot. Now, a patriot is somebody who wants independence from Great Britain, okay? They don't want to be a part of Great Britain anymore. They are somebody who is against the king, so they're just not happy with the situation they find themselves in. Now, on the other hand, loyalist is exactly the opposite, and you can tell just from the root word there of loyal, meaning that you are you stick with somebody, right? You know, you're loyal to them. It's like a dog being loyal to their owner, right? Your dog will do anything for you. They care about you, and that's what we say loyal means. So if you take a look at the word loyalist, right, it's somebody who liked the king. They were loyal to the king. They were against independence, and a term that you may hear me use or you may hear a video use from time to time is a slang term of Tory or Tories. Tories is the plural term, of course, of Tory. And that is just the same as saying a loyalist, but just wanted to let you guys know now in case I use that term in the future. You're also going to see two events listed there in bold and underlined that are stuff we have already talked about, namely the French and Indian War, which, if you remember, that was the conflict between Great Britain, the French, and the Native Americans over land, and that's what put Great Britain into such a huge debt that they needed to tax the colonists, which made the colonists unhappy, which then set them on a path of independence, kind of sparking that fuse to let all of the rest of these events happen. So that's why we include the French and Indian War as one of the 12 major events that happened during the American Revolution. So even if it's a little bit before, it's still really important to the beginning. You also see the Proclamation of 1763. This is something that we mentioned under our colonial dissatisfactions note sheet, as I think it was the last thing on that note sheet that talked about King George saying that the colonists were not allowed to move any farther west than the Appalachian Mountains. And this came as the order of the Proclamation of 1763. And yet again, it was one of those things that made these colonists unhappy and really kind of put them on a path, again, to independence and wanting to be free of Great Britain's rule. Here is where we get into the meat and potatoes of the revolution itself. Our first event that's actually going to be counted as part of the war is something we call the Boston Massacre. All right, you may have heard this before. It's not an uncommon event or an uncommon term to have talked about, so I really wouldn't be too surprised if you know a little bit about this. But the date that this happened is March 5th, 1770. You're going to need to know these dates because something that we're going to be doing in just a couple weeks is going to require you to put all these events in order. And so while they're already in order on your note sheet, you are still going to need to know the specific dates for each one of them. So the Boston Massacre was on March 5th, 1770. And this is how it went down. So colonists begin to yell at British soldiers in Boston. There's a little bit of a standoff. You've got your colonists on one side, and you've got your British soldiers on the other side, protecting or just being on duty, whatever they needed to do there in the Boston Square on March 5th, 1770. And as the colonists begin to yell at them, more soldiers arrived, and the colonists begin to get violent, all right? They begin to throw snowballs, sticks, and stones at these colonists. Whatever they could get their hands on that was laying in the street, they were grabbing it, picking it up, and throwing it at the soldiers. And of course, if you're a British soldier, you don't like being treated that way. You're not going to be happy about that, so you're going to retaliate. But unfortunately, they retaliated in the wrong way and, in fact, retaliated against the orders that they were originally given, which was not to fire. Instead, the British soldiers fired shots, and they ended up killing 5 colonists, which doesn't seem like that much. And it doesn't seem, when you think about it in the grand scheme of things, 5 lives, that's, no big deal. But they're innocent people, and people were really upset about that. But you also might be thinking to ourselves, why do we call it a massacre then? Because usually a massacre is used to describe a bloody killing of maybe hundreds of people, like a lot of people are dying. Why do we call it a massacre? Well, it was presented that way to the colonists through newspapers in order to make the British soldiers look a lot worse. And the picture that you see me having up here in the video, and also you see on your note sheets, that was a picture that was drawn by a man we've already talked about, Mr. Paul Revere. Remember I said he was going to be a part of 3 events in the Revolution? Well, here's event number 1, the Boston Massacre. He did that drawing that you see there on your note sheet and on the video here, and this was what we call a dramatization of the event that happens, and it just means that it's like a movie. They kind of oversell it. They make it seem worse than it really was. And part of that was calling it the Boston Massacre in all of the headlines, because that's what grabbed you. That's what caught your attention and made you want to read more, and fueled, if you didn't already like the British, it fueled your hatred even more for that as well. And Paul Revere made sure of this. He made sure that this drawing looked as gruesome as it possibly could, and he made sure that it was distributed to every major newspaper, printer, in the colonies, all right? So everyone was getting a copy of this drawing that depicted what had happened in Boston way up here, no matter if you were living down here in Virginia or in Georgia in one of the southern colonies. But that's the Boston Massacre. So this is one of the things that's not going to necessarily kick off the war officially, because there's one particular event that we'll talk about that does that. But it's, again, one of those things that fuels the hatred for the British from the colonists and their belief and their desire, their want to be free and independent. So a couple of years are going to go by, and not much is going to happen. There's going to be some issues here and there, but the next major event that we see happens on December 16th, 1773, and it is called the Boston Tea Party. I think this one's even more popularly known than the Boston Massacre, so you would probably know this one a little bit better. It's where a group of patriots called the Sons of Liberty, and you're going to need to know the name of that group, they were upset with the tax on tea, okay? You remember we talked about the Stamp Act way back in the colonial the colonial dissatisfactions notes. We talked about the Stamp Act, which was the tax that put was a decree that put a tax on anything made of paper. Well, this is exactly what it sounds like too with a tea tax. It's going to put a tax on all tea. And I explained in class how important tea is to the British lifestyle. They drink it almost every day with either their meal or after their meal, and it's just part of their social culture, especially during colonial times. So if you were using tea every day, you were also buying it a lot, and so this tax really wasn't good for these colonists. It was something that really upset them even more. 2 gentlemen, Mr. Samuel Adams, and wow, look at that. Who pops up again? Paul Revere. They dressed as Native Americans and snuck onto a ship that was holding tons and tons and tons of tea. Now, they weren't the only two to do this. You can see from the picture on your note sheets and in the video that there were many other men with them, members of the Sons of Liberty. But the most prominent or the most important members were Sam Adams and Paul Revere there. And they snuck onto this ship, and together they dumped 342 boxes of tea into the Boston Harbor. That's a lot of tea. And I'm not talking like, when you go to the grocery store and you've got a little box of tea. I'm talking about like a crate of tea, big. All right, lots and lots and lots of tea. And I forget right now the exact amount of money that actually cost the British companies whose tea that was and how much it would be in today's day and age. But we can talk about that in class when we go over these notes, because once you really realize how much money this was worth, you understand why this was such an important deal to the American Revolution and one of the reasons why it was started so successfully. But no bad deed goes unpunished, as one might say, and the punishment for the Boston Tea Party, which happened in 1774, is something called the Intolerable Acts. Now, I'd like to take a pause here and explain why we don't have a specific date for this event. Now, you notice that, like the Boston Tea Party, we said was December 16th, 1773. We have a specific day. Whereas the Intolerable Acts, we just give the year of 1774. This is because this is not a specific event that happened on one day necessarily. This is something that spanned over the course of a number of weeks, months, and even into years when we talk about the Intolerable Acts. So we just say that they started in 1774 because they were a direct punishment for the Boston Tea Party. All right, and that's actually our first bullet point right there. King George III, good old friend King George, he passed these to punish the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. And they included a number of different acts, but the two that you're absolutely going to need to know is the Quartering Act, which made the colonists house British soldiers, and the Boston Port Act. And I'll explain that in just a second. But moving back just a little bit, the Quartering Act essentially made it so that any British soldier could walk up to your front door, knock on it, and say, "Hi, I need a place to stay tonight, and I'm going to stay here." And there was nothing you could do about it because legally you had to allow them to do this, okay? So this is going to be, again, something that's not going to be taken lightly by the colonists because it's like an invasion of privacy. They can search whatever they want while they're there. They can look into whatever they want while they're there, all under the law that they need somewhere to stay. Now the Boston Port Act. I got a little ahead of myself there earlier. This closed the Boston Harbor until the colonists paid for the destroyed tea. And again, I'll talk about that monetary amount in class because I'm just not remembering exactly how much it was worth right now. I'll probably end up putting it in text at the bottom of the video when I edit. There you go. And then we'll talk about it in class as well. But until the colonists paid for that tea, they were going to close the Boston port. This was a problem because it was the biggest port in the colonies at the time. It did so much business and it put so many people to work. So not only were they not getting the goods coming in or going out, but the peoples whose jobs it were to load the ships, to take the stuff off, to transport this material to where it needs to go, they're not able to do that either, and they are out of work. So again, it's going to be something that really just made the colonists more upset. So all of these events, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Intolerable Acts, they're all things that kind of progress the anger, and it's like a boiling pot of water. We're getting closer and closer to the top, and soon it's going to boil over the edges, and things are going to go boom. But let's move on to our next event. We only got a couple more to do, guys. I'm sorry, this is a long video, but it's what we got to do. And if you don't finish it today, I'll carve out some more time the next day. So the First Continental Congress is going to be the next event, and this is going to have a date of September to October of 1774. So what happened is colonists felt that they should talk about the problems they were having with Great Britain. They felt like everybody, all 13 colonies, were having similar problems, and instead of trying to do this separately, they figured, why don't we come together, why don't we meet as in one group, and we can figure out a solution, as one, right? So 50 65 delegates, and delegates is another word for representatives. I'll continue to talk about that even into the next unit, so make sure you know that word. From all colonies except for Georgia, met in Philadelphia to ask King George to take away the intolerable acts. So they were trying to come up with a way to essentially say nicely, hey, can you get rid of these? We don't like them. And that's going to be very hard to do when you have a king who has absolute power and knows how to use it to a degree, all right? And after this initial meeting of the First Continental Congress, they agree to meet again if the king does not take them away. Unfortunately, this First Continental Congress is not going to work the way the colonists and the delegates had planned, and we see the outbreak of the Revolutionary War in 1775 at an event we call the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The colonists were stockpiling weapons in a city called Concord, Massachusetts, because they figured if we're going to raise an army to fight the British for independence, we're going to need weapons, and we better start getting them now before the British catch on too quick. Unfortunately, though, they already kind of caught on, and the British soldiers that were stationed in Boston found out and wanted to take those weapons away from the colonists, rightfully so if you're a British soldier, because they're going to end up being used against you. But here we see the third event that our good old friend Paul Revere is a part of, and Paul Revere rode ahead of the British troops. He knew that where they were going, and he rode on his horse ahead of them and warned the colonists living in the cities along that route, as well as in Concord, that the British were coming, all right? So they were able to be prepared. Now, you might have heard of this story before. You may have read it in elementary school. It's called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, and of course, the famous catchphrase from that is, the British are coming, the British are coming. That's what is rumored to be what he said as he rode through the towns yelling for the colonists to wake up and get ready. Now, several Patriot troops in a town a little bit south of Concord known as Lexington met the British soldiers, okay? They lined up and decided to take a stand, and for a while it was quiet, but unfortunately here, the first shot was fired. Nobody knows who shot the first shot, and it's very possible now with what we know today that it could have been somebody's gun mistakenly firing off into the air. But either way, this is known as the shot heard round the world because it kicks off the Revolutionary War, which, as history goes on, is a war that's going to have major repercussions or consequences throughout the entire world. When the British arrived at Concord, after a brief skirmish or a brief fight in Lexington, when the British arrived at Concord, most of the weapons were gone, taken with the Patriots who left the city. So really their plan in the beginning was just to get those weapons out of there, and it worked. They were able to stall the British long enough in Lexington to get those weapons out of there. Now, unfortunately, it comes at a price, and this battle was the start of the Revolutionary War. It doesn't take long, though, for the first major battle to happen, which we call the Battle of Bunker Hill. This happened in 1775, and like I just said, this is the first major battle of the Revolutionary War. This is the first time where we have an army that has been set up. We have a clear leader, a commander we know as George Washington, and he has created his ranks of soldiers and broken them up into their battalions, and we finally have an organized army. Unfortunately, the British win this battle. We were just not prepared enough for what the British were going to bring at us. But because we have just a random date of 1775, this means that it must have lasted longer than just one specific day, and it did. It lasted a few days, and the Patriots were able to hold off the best army in the world, the British Army, for a lot longer than they had expected. So despite losing, the battle gave hope to these inexperienced Patriots because they had never really fought in a war before, convincing them that, hey, we might actually be able to win this war. And it kind of puts the spark underneath them to really start trying and really start getting themselves out there a lot more. The British realized something too, though. They realized that a war with the colonists is going to be long, tough, and costly. It is not going to be an easy endeavor like they thought. They figured, it'll be easy to take down this group of farmers and with their muskets. No. They were able to take on the British Army in the Battle of Bunker Hill, and like I said, even though they lost, they were able to hold them off long enough to show that they were going to be major players in this war. All right, well, ladies and gentlemen, that is it for the events, or at least the first part of the events that we're going to talk about for the Revolutionary War. So at this time, go over your notes once more, make sure that everything has been filled in correctly, and if you need to, you can rewatch a part of this to get stuff filled in. Then you can rejoin us in the conference, and we will continue